Hi, good evening, everyone. Sorry for my tardy. This is Natalie Ellis with Esteem Counseling and Consulting Services, and we are on with Ask the Therapist. So again, I apologize for starting late, trying to find the right lighting. So today we're going to talk about self-esteem. That's been a conversation a lot with a lot of my clients these past few weeks, self-esteem. This is something that a lot of my clients and a lot of people in general this self-esteem is something that they're dealing with, whether it's some of my female clients or some of my male clients. So I just wanted to just give some brief information about self-esteem and how to work through some of those things. So a definition of self-esteem is the confidence in one's own worth or abilities. Self-esteem reflects an individual's overall subjective emotional evaluation of his or herself, or his or her own worth. And it's also an attitude towards yourself, a personal value. Okay, so these are different definitions of self-esteem. So ultimately, self-esteem is about how one sees themselves, the attitude that they have towards themselves. Okay? And obviously, a person's self-esteem can be healthy or unhealthy, or it can be high or low. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like, someone with healthy self-esteem or high self-esteem versus someone who has low self-esteem. So there's various variation of self-esteem. Okay, and what that looks like. So self-esteem can be based on numerous of things, such as our appearance, beliefs, our emotions, and how we see things, okay? Our thoughts, our thinking, and things of that sort. And research shows that there is a high correlation, or there's a direct relationship between self-esteem and our overall well-being, which makes sense, right? And so if I see myself in a positive way, then more likely I will be happier. I will see the world in a different way. The way that I act, the way that I behave, the way that I feel would also reflect this positivity versus if I see myself in a negative way. And so these are things to be aware of. And with a lot of my clients, that is a lot of what they struggle with. And I'll give some definitions again or some signs what low versus high self-esteem looks like. But a lot of the clients that I have that comes into my office, they're coming in because they're struggling with relationships, they're struggling with things at work, they're struggling with their own stuff based on their experiences and their inability to kind of work through these things and how we see ourselves impact that, right? So that's very important. So the importance of self-esteem. Self-esteem can impact us in so many ways, which is why it's an important thing to pay attention to. Our motivation, our success, relationships, our attitude, whether or not we are assertive versus not assertive, our beliefs. So self-esteem impacts all these things, okay? Self-esteem begins very, very early on. And so one thing I talk a lot with parents about when they have small children, that it begins very early. Before an individual knows who they are, their environment is kind of teaching them about themselves. So as a baby, you are learning about who you are based on what the environment is teaching you, based on what you're hearing from your mom, your dad, your caretaker, whoever all these people in your environment is. That's they're the one teaching you about who you are until you start getting your own thoughts, getting your own ideas, your own perceptions about yourself. So from 0 to 3, 4, 5, the environment is kind of teaching you about who you are. And so what the environment is telling us is significant. As a lot of you may know, based on your upbringings, if we have an environment that's very supportive versus an environment that's not so supportive, an environment that's validating, meaning when we say or do things, or let's take a baby for example. So I always start this. So when a baby cries, the environment tells the baby whether or not this is an environment that's safe or not. So when the baby is crying and is in distress, right? So how quickly the environment responds to that distress lets the baby know whether or not this environment is safe. And so The same thing with when this baby and the toddler begins to experience the world. So the environment is going to let the baby and toddler know, okay, how safe is this environment? And with that, the parent also teaches that baby, in terms of self-esteem, how the parent interacts with the baby, how the parent validates or not validates what the baby's going through. And so if the baby's in distress, or this young person or this toddler's in distress, and the environment is attuned to that distress and supports them and validates what's going on with them versus not, teaches also how their self-esteem, and teaches also how to respond to that environment in terms of safety. There's a level of safety that's also connected with self-esteem as well. So those are different things to pay attention to. So factors that contributes to self-esteem: positive or negative experiences of how you are treated within your environment, by your caretakers, by family members, by people around you. Physical disabilities, mental disabilities also impact self-esteem. Comparison to self or others impacts self-esteem. Genetics is a component of self-esteem as well. Age, when we experience different things, depending on the age that we are when we're experiencing, it can impact self-esteem as well. Personalities can influence and impact self-esteem. Reaction of others, the reaction of others to us, can influence our self-esteem. Our thinking patterns influence self-esteem. So there's a lot of different things that we have to take into account when we think about self-esteem. So when I talk to an individual, when they're coming in and I hear their story, so part of my assessment is always, the first thing is listening to their story, wherever they start. And from their story, I'm taking note as to what they're saying. I'm taking note to the different themes and patterns that I hear. And again, as I said earlier, a lot of my clients do struggle with self-esteem, self-worth, not being good enough, feeling as if they're not good enough. And these things impact in the decisions that they're making in their lives, in their relationships with their significant others, or with anyone in their lives. The other thing about relationships, and it typically goes to this, our family of origin is typically our first relationship. How we're relating to our moms, our dads, and people around us is our first relationships. And depending on, again, how healthy or unhealthy those relationships are, that's what we take on into the world. And so we have to look at those things as well. And so self-esteem is impacted by all of these things. Health, our physical health, and I talked about that as well. So, signs of healthy self-esteem. And so an individual who may have healthy self-esteem may look very confident, may speak in confident manner as well. They're able to say no, setting healthy boundaries, and I'm not sure which session it was when I talked about setting limits and setting boundaries in relationship. That's very, very, very important. Someone who struggles with their self-esteem, they already don't see themselves in the most light, in the most positive light, and so in their mind, other people don't see them in a positive light either. And so there's a lot of trying to please, right? And so when we're trying to please others, we don't have very good boundaries because we're wanting people to like us. And when we're wanting people to like us, again, boundaries is something that we tend to not do very well because we want to please people. So we have a hard time saying no because we don't want people to not like us, or we don't want people to see us in a negative light. And so that plays a part too. So setting healthy boundaries. So the person who has healthy self-esteem is able to say no and is able to set good boundaries. They have a positive outlook on things. And you can tell, I mean, you guys know this. People who tend to see the glass half full versus half empty. People who tend to see things in a negative way, see the negative side of things versus try to see the positive side of things. And so how they're speaking and how they're interacting with you lets you kind of know where people are, where they're at as well. And speak on their self-esteem, how they see themselves, and then in turn how they see the world. So positive outlook on things, people who have high self-esteem, their ability to see their overall strengths, and so not so much focus on they don't so much focus on their weaknesses so much. They're aware of their weaknesses because, again, none of us are perfect. We all have weaknesses. Versus someone with unhealthy self-esteem, they focus on the weakness. That seems to overpower who they are versus their strengths. And again, in sessions, that people with low self-esteem, we have to work a lot on finding the things that they're good at and their accomplishments. And so that's something we have to work on. So people with high self-esteem tend to focus on their strength and value their strengths. They tend to appreciate themselves more because they know their worth. So people with high self-esteem, they appreciate themselves. They tend to make their own decisions. Sometimes when we, when we have low self-esteem, we doubt ourselves. There's a lot of doubt. So our decision-making skills are not the best. We tend to overthink things and not think, and thinking, oh, it's wrong, we're going to make mistakes. So there's a lot of that happens as well. What's the difference between narcissistic people and people with low self-esteem? That's a very good question. So that's something I'll have to talk more about with narcissism. There's a book that I've read with clients that focuses on narcissistic people with narcissistic personalities and how that impacts relationships. But yeah, there is a difference because a person with low self-esteem isn't necessarily a narcissist. They're not necessarily self-indulge in their own in just themselves. The narcissistic person tends to only see themselves and focus on themselves. The narcissist, and they don't always present as having low self-esteem. So unlike the person with low self-esteem who's unable to see their strength or does not focus on the positive about themselves, the narcissist, they're able to see their strength. They're able to see that. They're just very self-absorbed, and they're self-absorbed in focusing on all the positive things about them, of who they are, and they want other people to see the same thing too. So a little different than how the person with low self-esteem may be. But that could be a topic in itself, narcissism. All right, let's see, anybody else? Oh, between high self-esteem and low self-esteem. So, yeah, these are the high self-esteems that I'm talking about right now. People with high self-esteem tend to have confidence. They tend to have healthy boundaries. They tend to have a positive outlook on life. They tend to focus on their strength versus their weaknesses. They tend to appreciate themselves. They tend to make their own decisions about things in their lives. They tend to have respectful and loving relationships because not only they treat themselves well, they appreciate themselves, but they appreciate others as well. So those are different things of people with high self-esteem. So, or healthy self-esteem. So signs of unhealthy self-esteem or low self-esteem is kind of like the opposite of the ones with high self-esteem. They have a negative outlook on things. These are the people that tend to complain. And not just complain, but don't see not offer solution. They're not very, they tend to be problem-focused, not solution-focused. People who with low self-esteem, because again, they're not, it's almost as if no matter what, there's always a but. No matter what the suggestion, there's always a but because of the inability to see the positive outlook on things, right? So they tend to lack confidence. Sometimes there's a lot of shame there. So obviously sometimes people with low self-esteem, it's a buildup. It's not something that just may have happened all of a sudden. So it may be a buildup of experience, a buildup of things that kind of led to that point. And so with a lot of clients, I go from the beginning, no matter how old they are. When the younger they are, obviously the beginning is not so far out. But even with my 70-year-old clients, we go to the beginning. It's important to understand the root of their upbringing, their parent interaction, because again, our parents, our family of origin is our first relationship, our first love, our first mentor, our first teacher, our first boyfriend, the first everything. And so how that relationship is and how that interaction goes dictates a lot of things. And again, when we're a child, if our parents tell us, if the people around us is telling us we're beautiful, that's what we're believing. Right? So yes, the roots. We got to go to the roots to kind of get an idea of where some of this is coming from. And so a lot of people with low self-esteem, their roots or their upbringing sometimes have a lot of negativity in terms of not feeling validated. So I'm going to say this. There may not be a lot of bad things that happen to these people. However, there's a lot of subtle things that may have happened that created this. So, for example, I have a client who, when she was young, she had a feeling of feeling sad. And so she went to her parents and says, I was feeling sad about something. And then because she was 6, 7, her parent dismissed that. When we're dismissed, when our thoughts, our feelings, our actions, if who we are and what we say and what we do is dismissed, especially as kids, and again, as kids get dismissed a lot, right? And then so personality, other things plays a part. So if who we are and what we say and what we do is dismissed, meaning it's ignored, it's not taken seriously, it's not validated, it's you know what, you don't know what you don't know what you're feeling, which is what her father did to her. You don't know what you're feeling. So of course, when those things begin to happen, and some of these things happen early, then that questions. Then you're, well, maybe I don't feel that, or maybe I don't think that, or maybe I'm not like that. Then you're questioning yourself, because this is what the environment is dismissing what's going on with you. And so when that's a constant, when you're thinking this or feeling that or doing this, and the environment is telling you, no, don't do that, don't feel that, don't think that, no, then that becomes a disconnect. Then there's a disconnect with who you are and what the environment is telling you. That creates your self-esteem or your worth. It gets to be in question, And again, as kids, you don't understand all this. So this is just happening. So now you're becoming a teenager and an adult, and it's like, well, maybe I don't really feel that. Or well, maybe I don't really know. And so for her, this particular client was a lot of it, because a lot of who she was dismissed in so many ways. I don't really know who I am. I'm whatever this person wants me to be in that moment. And so who she is in terms of herself, her self-worth, she doesn't know. And that's something we have to start from fresh. And she's in her 20s. Start from the beginning. And so, yeah, these things, a lot of these things do impact the perceptions of how we see ourselves. And that begins very, very, very early on, before we even have words to speak. And so, if a baby from the beginning is always being told how beautiful and is validated, then that baby believes that, right? Versus the baby who becomes a toddler and believes the environment is praising them, the environment is supporting what they do, the environment is validating their thoughts and their feelings. And so that's a different type of experience than being raised or being in an environment that dismisses everything about you. Because at some point you begin to dismiss those things too, right? As a child. And so again, as you become an adult, these are things that you begin to struggle with. And so that's the self-esteem, that's the conflict of all that. The great thing about self-esteem is that it's not fixed, so it can always be changed and shifted, and we could process and we could talk about these things and kind of retrain. So I talk to clients a lot about retraining the brain. And so there's a great book that I'm reading by Sonia Renee Taylor. One of the things she talks about in her book, and the book is called The Body's Not an Apology. One of the great things she talks about is when we become adults, the thoughts that we have, a lot of the negative thoughts, we believe that they're our own thoughts when we've been trained for such a long time to believe these things based on, again, the environment. And so a lot of times the person with low self-esteem, so again, there's many components, the environment as well as genetics, personality, age, there's so many things that plays into part, but for a long time, who they are have been reinforced by their environment. And we start to believe, you know what? I am ugly. There's nothing positive about me. There's nothing good about me. You start to think this is you thinking these things, but sometimes it's not always the case. And so sometimes we have to separate the things we've been trained to think for such a long time about who we are. And so a big thing with clients is helping them recognize, there's a different thought, and how do we create this? How do we retrain to have a different type of thinking, which then creates different emotions, different feelings, different actions, different things as well. But the hard part I'm noticing with clients is taking that action. So intellectually they get it. People get it. I know the things I need to do, but I'm just scared to. I'm just afraid to. So then there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of fear of judgments. So with one of my male clients, who's also in his 20s, well, if I do this, what will people think of me? So there's a lot of fears of judgment, of how people would think, because there's that people-pleasing piece of it as well. All right? And so when we're noticing that our low self-esteem is impacting our decision-making skills, it's impacting our mood, our emotion, it starts to impact our life in a negative way, then it's important that we seek help. We seek support. We seek professional counseling if necessary. Because our self-esteem, again, research shows that it directly impacts our overall well-being. And so when our well-being is not well, or our well-being is not healthy, or our self-esteem is not healthy, then it infiltrates all aspects of our lives in every way. And so definitely seeking help and support when that's the case. So if no one else has any questions, these are some basic things I want to talk about self-esteem and, things to be aware of in regards to self-esteem, and definitely seeking the help and to start talking about where our own self-esteem and how we see ourselves, and recognizing how that's impacting our daily life. One thing also I talk to clients about, just like when I was looking at the research, self-esteem is not about not having any flaws. A person with high self-esteem is not that they're not recognizing their flaws. We're humans. We all have flaws. No one's perfect. And so it's being able to see our strengths, see our weaknesses, see our faults, see everything about us, and still know that we're worthy, right? And so at the end of the day, it's still knowing that we're worthy, still knowing that we deserve the best, and still knowing that we could see ourselves still in a good way despite some of the negative things about us, some of our faults and some of our flaws. And so that's the key. And so with a lot of clients, we have to identify not just a lot of the strengths, but then recognizing the faults, and then how do we get to a place of changing the things that we don't want to accept about us. If there's some things that needs to be changed, and needs to change, and then accepting some of the things that is a part of who we are, and those are the things that also makes us unique, right? And so with self-esteem, it's also recognizing the uniqueness about us as individuals too. Okay, so those are just some brief things I want to talk about in regards to self-esteem. I'm Natalie Ellis. I have a private practice in Decatur, Georgia area. Definitely, if you are in need of a therapist or a counselor, seek the help that you need. But I'm available, and how do you keep high self-esteem from becoming narcissistic traits in kids? Well, that's a good one. Yeah, and so with narcissism, a lot of times with narcissism, they only see themselves. So there's a lack of care for others, right? And so you could have self-esteem, high self-esteem, but also care for others. It's making sure you care for others, which is an important thing. Making sure you're considerate of others, respecting others. So these components have to be there. So somebody who thinks very high of themselves doesn't mean that they can't think high of others either. So if I think very high of myself, but then I'm putting somebody down, that's not high self-esteem. People with high self-esteem don't put people down. And so the bullies, if you notice people are putting other people down, or rejecting or not validating people, or put downs, or control. So there's a level of control too. People with narcissistic trait, there's a level of control that's with that too. So people who tend to put others down, that's not that doesn't necessarily equate to high self-esteem. Because if you have high self-esteem and you respect yourself, there's not a need to have to put someone else down. The person who's putting somebody else, there's something else that's going on with them. That's not necessarily equate. So a lot of people may look like they're confident or have, I don't want to say high self-esteem, but anyone who puts other people down, or who belittles or who rejects. There's certain things that people do in terms of hurting others, right? That doesn't equate to high self-esteem. So that could be something else. So somebody who's high self-esteem can potentially be a narcissist, but having high self-esteem doesn't mean you're a narcissist, right? So I just want to clarify that, right? Because esteem is a positive regard about oneself, right? Meaning, if you could have a positive regard about oneself, you should also have a positive regard about someone else. When you don't see no one else, then that's a whole other issue. So with narcissism, but that's a great topic. I'm going to have to research more on narcissistic traits and to talk about that, because that is something I do have a client who tends to be that, and she's a child, so, and she tends to be narcissistic, but based on her behaviors, her manipulation, the things she says, it's a difference with the high self-esteem too. So it looks different. It looks different. But definitely when we're trying to when we're teaching someone to have high self-esteem, we want to make sure we're teaching about being respectful, caring for others, being considerate of others. We're teaching these things as well, right? So that's important to do as well. All right, so that was a great question. All right. So again, if anybody needs to seek a therapist, definitely go to your local Psychology Today. As you could go based on your zip code and see if there's any therapists in your area. But I'm in the Decatur, Georgia area, or Metro Atlanta area, where I see individual clients, children, 3-year-olds all the way to adults. I see couples. I do groups. I do trainings out of my office, workshops out of my office as well. So please send a text, a message if you have some more questions in regards to self-esteem or anything in regards to mental health. So my philosophy is about empowering, educating, enriching, and motivating individuals to be their best self by understanding, obviously, their mental health and talking about their mental health. Okay? So thank you so much for joining me tonight, and I appreciate you. Thank you. Have a good evening.